between finance, macroeconomics, and frankly, ethical concerns about how to make the world better. John was a role model and a mentor to many of us, myself included, and his family, his friends, his colleagues from around the world, including our speaker today, Ben Friedman, came together to endow this lecture series at the Peterson Institute in his honor. It has been a very distinguished lecture series. In the previous lecturers, we have had George Akerlof, Sheila Bair, Alan Blinder, Stephen Cicchetti, and Eric Rosengren. And of course, this year have Ben Friedman. The Olcay Lecture for 2020 was postponed due to the pandemic, but we already know the next lecturer, who will be Thomas Jordan, chairman of the governing board of the Swiss National Bank, another friend of John's, another practitioner, and another person at the intersection of finance, macro, and ethical behavior. I would like to just thank again John's wife, Phoebe Miller Olcay, John's two daughters, Charlotte Olcay Hoagland and Margot Olcay, and their husbands, Nick Hoagland and Jack Kaplan, for their support of the series and their engagement. But the real reason, of course, we're here, as much as we hope to carry on John's legacy, is the substances he would always wanted. And therefore, we're very privileged to have with us Benjamin M. Friedman today. Ben is, as I mentioned, the William Joseph Mayer Professor of Political Economy and former chairman of the Economics Department at Harvard University. He's written two best-selling and widely read and still cited books for more popular general interest audiences: Day of Reckoning, The Consequences of American Economic Policy under Reagan and After, and The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. His new book, Religion After the Rise of Capitalism, is a breakthrough work of intellectual history and application, looking at the questions of how the religious debates, particularly of the Protestants in the Anglo-Saxon and Scottish tradition, have influenced our thinking about economics and our political debates to this day, and how that led to the forms and justifications for capitalism we now have. At a time when there's so much questioning going on, quite justifiably, of how well our system works and how just our system is, it's incredibly important to have Ben Friedman speaking on this point. I would just note that Ben was the leader of the Monetary Economics Group at the National Bureau of Economic Research for many years and has contributed significantly in that field as well as in finance. He has been a trustee of the Pioneer Funds, a director of the Council for Economic Education, and he's still serving as a director of the Private Export Funding Corporation. He also was a longtime director and member of the editorial board of Encyclopedia Britannica. Ben was a junior fellow at Harvard and a Marshall fellow at Cambridge, and has been teaching at Harvard for now over 50 years, where I and many others had the privilege to learn from him. With that, let me turn it over to Ben for today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm delighted to be here with you and delighted to speak on my new book with your audience. I'm going to use the share screen function, if I may, to do you have that all right?
Not yet, Ben.
Okay. Let me try it again in that case.
There you go.
How is that one?
That works? Thank you.
Is that one okay?
Yes, that works. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm delighted to be with you today. It's always an honor to speak on behalf of the Peterson Institute, but I want to take a minute to say how honored and pleased I am to be giving the Institute's John Olcay Lecture. John was a close and very valued friend to me for more than 40 years. We were very close friends, both personally, also intellectually. Many of my papers over these years have footnotes saying that this paper began as a conversation with John Olcay. He inspired much of my work and encouraged me and supported me along the way. It's a great privilege to me to give this lecture in his memory, and it means a lot to me, I should say, that John's widow, Phoebe, and his two daughters, Margot and Charlotte, are both participating today. So Phoebe, Margot, and Charlotte, this lecture is for you and also in memory of John. And I'd like to move on to show one paragraph, if I may, from the acknowledgments to the book. And I'll read this, if I may. One element of sadness, perhaps inevitable in carrying out a project like this over a span of years, is that some of the colleagues and friends who were most supportive and helpful along the way are no longer here to see the final product. It is too late to thank them for their encouragement and their friendship, but I do remember with gratitude and affection Dan Bell, Bill Hutchinson, John Olcay, Frank Schott, and Bob Silvers. I miss them all, and that's a very true sentiment of mine. So especially today, I think of John. Now, what is the question that I'm undertaking to address in this work? It's where our economics came from. And the emphasis is on ours. There are many forms of economics, but I'm interested in our economics, meaning modern Western economics, the same kind we teach in virtually every American university. And I want to know why it emerged, when and where it did. And to be specific, what I have in mind as the centerpiece of modern Western economics is what we often call the first fundamental welfare theorem, namely that individuals, when they act in no more than their own self-interest, not requiring any altruism, but when they do so in a competitive market setting, are nonetheless able to make not only themselves, but other people better off as well. If you stop to think about it, that's a very fundamental insight and a very important proposition, both in economics and economic policy. And this I take to be the centerpiece of our modern Western economics. Now, where did that come from? The standard view associates this idea with Adam Smith, in particular his book from 1776, The Wealth of Nations. Donald Winch, alas no longer with us, but in our time, the foremost Smith scholar, identified the wealth of nations as the fountainhead of all of classical political economy. And the second usual presumption is that Smith's work was a part of the Enlightenment and therefore was part of a movement away from what we in our vocabulary would call a God-centered universe toward, again in our vocabulary, secular humanism. And the best expression of that was Nick Phillipson's prize-winning biography of Adam Smith from some years ago, in which Phillipson wrote that not just the wealth of nations, but the entire project for a modern science of man that Smith was carrying out in his work was built on the foundations of the Enlightenment's, this is Phillipson's word, quintessential assault on religion. Now, I'm going to accept the first of these presumptions. I agree with Donald Winch that Smith's work is the fountainhead of our political economy, but I'm going to reject the second part. And instead, I'm going to argue that the Smithian revolution, which we rightly associate with him and his contemporaries like David Hume, was importantly enabled by the new religious thinking that was then taking hold in the English-speaking Protestant world in which Smith lived. The specific feature of that new religious thinking on which I'm going to focus is the turn away from orthodox predestinarian Calvinism and the way in which that turn away from Calvinism opened the path for a new, more optimistic and more expansive view of the possibilities for human choice, human action, human agency, And I believe that it's that more expansive view of the possibilities of human agency that enabled Smith's thinking and therefore gave us modern Western economics. Now, I want to be clear at the outset that what I am not claiming is that any of this had to do with self-conscious attempts by religiously committed individuals to bring their religious beliefs to bear on their professional thinking. Hume, for example, was a notorious, at best, agnostic, probably an atheist. Hume referred to Church of England bishops as agents to superstition. His phrase, he was an opponent of any form of organized religion. His great friend, William Robertson, the head of the Church of Scotland, referred to him as a virtuous heathen. Adam Smith is more complicated. Smith was very private about his private religious beliefs, but we should at best think of Smith as something like the kind of deist that we in America would associate with Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. So if that's not the story, what is the story? I think the idea that I have in mind is the kind of influence of what Einstein famously called a worldview, Weltbild, in Einstein's German. Einstein famously wrote that scientific thought is a development of pre-scientific thought. Here's what Einstein said about the world, the Weltbild, the world view, that what we try to do is think for ourselves of a simplified image of the world, and therefore use that image to cut through the complexity that would otherwise get in our way. And Einstein made very clear that he wasn't just thinking about physicists. He explicitly mentioned painters and poets and philosophers. All of these came within his view. This is a familiar idea, not limited to scientists. Here's what Ralph Waldo Emerson thought. Emerson wrote that any writer needs a basis that he can't supply on his own. He called it a chaos deep soil. And Emerson thought that writers got that from the popular mind at the time. And he said that the ideas of the time are in the air. And an interesting phrase, this is again Emerson, infecting everybody who believe it and breathe it. And we pick up from our contemporaries what's there, he says, almost through the pores of our skin. Now, does this idea apply to economics? Neither Emerson nor Einstein referred to economics, but certainly economists have thought it did. My Harvard predecessor, Joseph Schumpeter, wrote that any kind of analysis in economics is a product of what he called pre-analytic vision. Schumpeter was attached enough importance to it that he used a capital V. That's his capital letter, not mine. My late colleague and dearly missed friend Ken Galbraith wrote that economic ideas are always and intimately a product of their own time and place. And I'm arguing that the ideas that Smith and Hume advanced were very much a product of their time and their place, including the religious revolution that was going on at just that time. So let's pause a moment just to make sure we understand what the great advance was that we associate with Adam Smith. If we go back to 1700, before Smith was born, and ask what was economic thinking at that time, could individuals correctly perceive their own self-interest? Most people thought no. That's the reason people favored mercantilist, dirigiste means of directing economic activity. It couldn't be left to individuals on their own. But importantly, even if individuals did correctly perceive what was in their own self-interest, there was no reason to think that their acting on it would make anybody but themselves better off. And for that reason, actions that people would take motivated by their self-interest were considered to be vicious. The standard adjective used to describe such behavior was vicious. This was called a vice. If we come forward to 1790, I picked that year because that's when Smith died. Answer to the first question, could people understand their self-interest? The answer was yes, if they are acting in their capacity as producers of goods and services. Very interestingly, Smith was a very subtle thinker, and in the same way that a mathematician doesn't want to make assumptions that are unnecessarily strong to prove whatever theorem he has in mind, Smith did not assume that people get it right when they make choices as consumers. In fact, Smith was scathing in his contempt for people's consumer choices, especially among the rich. But he did think that when people act as producers, they were able to see correctly their own self-interest. Second, and most importantly, I'll go on with this in a moment, Smith understood that when people act in their self-interest under the right conditions, they will make other people better off as well as themselves. And then thirdly, because of this insight, by the time Smith died in 1790, the whole vocabulary of vice and vicious was simply gone. It no longer applied to actions taken in one's self-interest. So let's expand for a moment on this. To be clear, Smith did have intellectual precursors. Here are the names of some of them. Some people in both France and England at the time had the same idea. And so we have to confront the issue of whether they deserve the credit for this insight instead of Smith. My answer would be a resounding no. And the reason is that none of these people had any serious explanation for how this result came about. In effect, they were like, again, mathematicians who were able to state a theorem without proving it. They had no knowledge of or understanding of the role of markets and competition. They had no other mechanism to suggest, and especially for a generation of people who had all been educated in Newtonian thinking. Newton's Principia had been published in 1687, and by the time we get to the middle of the 18th century, it was part of the standard curriculum, certainly at Cambridge, certainly at all of the Scottish universities on the continent as well. By this time, everybody thought as Newtonians. They wanted to know what was the mechanism. They wanted to know what was a systematic explanation, and therefore nobody had it, and then Smith got it. So what, in brief, was Smith's argument in The Wealth of Nations? He took the desire for material gain among humans as simply an assumed fact. Smith has this marvelous line in The Wealth of Nations in which he says that the desire to better our conditions comes with us from the womb and stays with us to the grave, and there's scarcely a moment in between when it departs from us. And he goes on to be very clear that when he speaks of bettering our condition, he means our economic condition. And for this reason, this desire to better our condition is morally legitimate. It's no more opprobrious than the fact that we eat or the fact that we breathe. At the center of Smith's argument is the role of competitively set wages and prices, therefore the need for markets. And as a well-educated Newtonian, Smith thought in terms of mechanism and system. He saw these competitively set wages and prices as the product of interpersonal bargains between sellers on the one side, including sellers of labor, and buyers on the other side. There was no altruism involved. Everybody was simply pursuing his own self-interest, and therefore he saw competitive markets as the ideal example of the Enlightenment principle of unintended and even unforeseen consequences. Most important, Smith saw that when people carry out their self-interest in competitive market settings, this leads to making other people better off as well. And of course, this is the proposition that we identify as the invisible hand. Interestingly so, because Smith himself didn't place a lot of emphasis on the phrase. He used it only once in each of his books, but it's the phrase that we attach to the proposition, so much so that it's become iconic. This is the famous statue of Adam Smith that stands in the Market Square in Edinburgh, not far from where Smith's office was in his later days. The statue is full of wonderful symbolism, but the hands are the ones that I'm after at the moment. If you look, you'll notice that you can easily see Smith's left hand, but notice that the right hand is occluded and in a way that you can't quite see it. And that's the sculptor Sandy Stoddart's attempt to represent the symbolism of the invisible hand. And because of this invisible hand property of the competitive market mechanism, Smith was clear that he was opposed to this whole range of impedimenta to competition that was present in the world in which he lived, things like government-granted monopolies, collusion by business people, and so forth. And therefore, he opposed these impediments, but importantly, what Smith emphasized was the robustness, the power of the market mechanism. He did not think of competitive markets as some hothouse flower that needed to be protected against every single germ that might be thrown up against it. And as a result, he was very prepared to support and did support all sorts of interferences with markets when he thought they were appropriate. And especially for those of you who are watching this while headquartered in Washington, as Adam, I know you are, in that city, you frequently see people wearing Adam Smith neckties. And so next time you see somebody wearing an Adam Smith necktie, you should go up to the person and say, "Oh, I see that you're in favor of progressive income taxes. How nice." Or say, "I see that you believe that people who ride Mercedeses should pay special luxury taxes on their cars." Or, "I see that you're in favor of much tighter regulation on banks than what we have today." Because Smith, in fact, was in favor of all of those things. Now, the question that I address in my new book is what enabled Adam Smith, and in a much more limited way, any of his predecessors, to come to this insight? Well, of course, it was, again, their training in Newton's ideas of system and mechanism. They lived in a society that was becoming increasingly commercial, and they observed what was happening all around. And especially in the case of Smith, Smith was not an economist. The word didn't even exist in his lifetime. He was a moral philosopher, and he was a very thoughtful and insightful one. So introspection was a part of the story. But I believe that the transition in religious thinking in the English-speaking Protestant world in which they lived was a very important part of the story. So let's talk for a few minutes about the substantive content of this turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. There were three elements of the turn in religious thinking that I argue were very important for the creation of Smithian economics. First was the issue of human nature. Instead of believing in what Calvin called the utter depravity of all individuals, people in the English-speaking Protestant world were coming to believe that every individual has an inherent goodness from birth. Second, in terms of our ultimate spiritual destiny, instead of believing, according to Calvin, that individuals are predestined according to who will be spiritually saved in the afterlife and who will not, to the extent that people have no way of influencing this decision. According to Calvin, the predestination decision is made not only before each individual was born, but even before the world was created. Instead, people now started to believe that everyone was potentially able to be saved, and most importantly, that people's choices and actions mattered for this purpose. And then finally, in terms of the question of why we are here on the planet, the idea of Calvin is that the sole reason for man's existence is the glorification of God. And instead, now people started to believe that human happiness was certainly a part of the divine intent, and maybe even the greatest part of divine intent. Now, this issue was not only underway, but was hotly contended. These were questions that people fought and men died for. So they mattered importantly to people. They were at the very heart of the English Civil War, which had taken place in the lifetime of Smith's and Hume's grandfathers. And this debate was a rolling process. It was at its height in England in the latter part of the 17th century. It was at its height in Scotland in the first half of the 18th century, when Smith and Hume were coming to young adulthood. There was a fierce battle within the Church of Scotland between the people who called themselves moderates and the people whom today we call evangelicals. And then the debate over Calvinism moved forward, and in the latter half of the 18th century was the dominant issue in American Protestantism. Now, why it's worth pausing on the question of why this religious debate would have influenced what Einstein would call the worldview, what Schumpeter would have called the capital V vision of people like Smith and his contemporaries. We don't normally today think of religious ideas as affecting the thinking of people in other fields. Well, one reason was simply that they lived in a world in which religion was much more central and important and multidimensional than anything we know in modern Western society. Every educational institution was a religious foundation. And incidentally, that was true in America at the time. My university was certainly a religious foundation at that time. It was true for patronage by the time Smith was born. Scotland had given up its status as an independent nation, so all religious patronage was gone from the Scottish Parliament, which no longer existed. It was an aspect of religion only, but religion was very much an aspect of politics. Intellectual life, importantly, was integrated in that day in a way that we don't know in our time. Take, for example, university faculties. Smith was a professor at the University of Glasgow. In those days, nobody had yet thought to separate off the theologians into distinct divinity schools, as it is at my university and other prominent ones around the United States. Faculties were integrated. Here's a listing of the professorships at Glasgow during Smith's day. Interestingly, there were only 14 of them. Smith was the professor of moral philosophy, but right on his own faculty was a professor of divinity, what we would today call theology, and a professor of church history. When these people dealt with each other, they were dealing in each other's subjects. Scotland, especially Edinburgh, had at that time a famous flourishing of intellectual life with intellectual dining societies. The most distinguished of them was called the Select Society. They would gather for dining and discussion. Here's a listing of the original 31 members of the Select Society, in categorizing them by profession. Smith was one of the 4 academics. Hume was a member, but importantly, 5 of the 31 were Church of Scotland ministers, including their great friend, William Robertson, who was the head of the church. And then finally, to repeat, there was the extraordinary contentiousness of religious debate, not just at this time, but going back for 200 years, the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, the Highland Rebellion. The Highland Rebellion, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, was of course about whether the Stuart monarchy would be restored, but that was in part about religion. The important part of that was that the Stuarts were Roman Catholic and the Hanoverians who had replaced them were Protestant. So this had been taken. The Highland Rebellion right around Edinburgh took place when Smith was 22 years old. He could not but help but have noticed. Now, finally, and I think most importantly, there is a strong substantive coherence between the new religious thinking of the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism and the new economics that Smith and his colleagues gave us. So to start with the nature of human beings, if you believed that all human character is spiritually depraved, so that, as Calvin put it, and as is repeated in the Westminster Confession, people are unable to tell good from evil or right for wrong or act on the difference, and they have no ability to prevent their eternal damnation, it's not a great stretch to extend that to think that people are not able to distinguish good from bad in a morally neutral context, including perhaps understanding their own self-interest, and they're certainly unlikely to be able to make others better off merely by acting according to their nature, which is again depraved. And by contrast, if you believed instead that humans are born with inherent goodness, if, taking John Locke's famous metaphor, people have the candle of the Lord by which to see if they will only make use of it, Locke's phrase, then not only would you be likely to think that people are able to make moral choices and act morally, but it's not much of an extension to think that in the secular realm, they could understand economic interests and they might well be able to act in ways that lead to good outcomes for other people too. In terms of human agency, if you believe in predestination, meaning you can't affect or even contribute to your own salvation, then again, it's not much of an extension to think that you're also unable to improve your own economic lot, and you presumably couldn't contribute to others as well, others' well-being too. And by contrast, if instead you think, as the post-Calvinists did, that people have free will and choice, to use another phrase of the day, that they are free moral agents, morally conscious as well, then they are able to cooperate with God in achieving their own salvation. Cooperate is a word introduced into this discussion by John Tillotson, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed by William and Mary after the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and extending that to the secular realm, people's human choices, actions, agency could also improve their own and others' economic condition. And then finally, in terms of human purpose, if you believe that there's no religious value attached to human happiness, then it's a good question why the world would be structured so as to foster human well-being. And by contrast, if you thought that human happiness was a part of the divinely intended purpose for humans on Earth, then of course it follows that we have the ability to lead a moral life and achieve our salvation. That would just be a part of the divine benevolence toward humans. But it's also why the world, including our own nature and also social institutions like markets, would be designed and evolve in order to enable humans to achieve secular aspects of their salvation. And so my argument is that these new religious ideas were very much a part of the Einsteinian Weltbild, the Schumpeterian vision that people like Smith and Hume brought to their thinking about the secular world, and that in effect, Smith and his contemporaries were secularizing the dominant religious thinking of their time and place. And the centerpiece of it was this more expansive, and I would say more optimistic view of the possibilities for human choice and human agency that became part of modern Western economics. Now, I'll stop here, but let me simply say that this religiously motivated thinking has survived what I'll call the, following Weber, the atrophication of the religious impulse that gave rise to it. Weber saw this kind of religious thinking as a kind of catalyst. It makes something happen, and what it makes happen is gone after the catalyst. What it makes happen is still there after the catalyst is gone. And I think this is the case. Today, economics is still all about human agency. It's about the choices that we make and the actions that we therefore take. The first fundamental welfare theorem, to repeat that we can make other people better off as well as ourselves by acting in no more than our own self-interest when we do so under conditions of competitive markets. That remains the centerpiece of modern economics. And I think in many other ways as well, the kind of expansive and optimistic view of human agency that Smith and Hume introduced to what became our subject has remained the heart of it. And especially here in the United States, this influence of the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism has, I think, resonated within Western economics ever since. After all, we're now 2.5 centuries since Smith's early adulthood. And just to tick off a few of the evidences of this kind of influence over the years, in the early 19th century in America, the great issue was free trade versus protectionism. It's fascinating that the people on both sides of that debate anchored their argument in the kind of thinking that Smith and behind him the religious figures of the day had argued. In the late 19th century, there was a profound argument, which in many ways continues now, over the role of government. People that we think of as the social gospelers versus the gospel of wealth. This was all very much in the same mode. In the late 19th and the early 20th centuries was when we saw for the first time economics emerging not just as a descriptive analytical subject, but a prescriptive one, recommending economic policies. And we have the same arguments over government activism in the 20th century and today. And I would argue also that today the economic policy views, which we may find puzzling of many of our fellow Americans, are anchored in this kind of nexus of economic and religious thinking. And so understanding the religious origins of our economic thinking is not just, it is of course a matter of economic intellectual history. It's a matter of getting the intellectual history right, but it importantly bears on our economic and economic policy debate today as well. Adam, I think I've hit the limit of the time that you generously gave me, and so I will stop and turn the floor back to you, and I'm happy to engage in discussion with you or any of the other people who are here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Just to tell everyone who is here two things. First, Professor Friedman's slides and the video of this presentation will be on the PIIE website starting this afternoon, and everyone will have that available in perpetuity. Though, of course, Ben would want, and we all would want you to consider buying the book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. The second point is, because of the large turnout, to keep the flow going, we ask people who wish to pose questions to put them on the Q&A function in Zoom. I will group them and, where possible, attribute to who asked the questions when posing them to Ben. While people put questions up, though, Ben, let me start the discussion. One thing which you do in your book, and which I know you care about, is the links between the kinds of arguments and ideologies and beliefs you discuss and their effect on decisions made in the election we just had in the US, their effect on the current perceptions of economic policy in the US. Because of time, you didn't quite get to that. Could you just say a bit more about how this relates to the recent political events in the United States?
Yes, I will. And because you were kind enough to warn me that you were going to ask me that question, I have some slides that address it. And so I will go back to the share screen, if I may, and return to my slides. So let's see if we can do that. Should be there, and let me come down to where that begins.
Okay, but unfortunately, quickly, because we do have other questions to get to. Thank you.
Okay. Well, the key issue is why so many Americans vote against their economic self-interest. And the standard political science explanation for this is that we have a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. We vote for candidates and parties, not for policies specifically. And therefore, the standard political science view is that people know that by voting in ways that undermine food stamps and supplemental income and the like, they are undermining their self-interest, but that's the only way in our system they can vote for social policies about which they care. And my answer is that that's insufficient because it fails to explain why, according to the survey data, so many of these people whose voting behavior is at the center of this supposed puzzle have views that correlate very sharply with their religious affiliation. And therefore, my explanation for this supposedly puzzling behavior is that, especially in light of these religious views, religious origins of our economic ideas, in the end, they're not that puzzling after all. So let me leave it at that, but I'm happy to go into it further if you'd like.
Thank you, Ben. Just trying to make sure we cover a bunch of topics. Your views on this are very important. A second question I wanted to raise, again, from the perspective of today, is that there is almost no discussion in your book about issues directly of racial inequality or sexism or racism. I presume this is in large part, because the thinkers you discuss were not confronting those issues directly. But from today's perspective on the US and Western economic development, it seems like quite an omission. If I can go a step further, there are a lot of people for whom racism or sexism or other forms of bias might be a motivation against having a welfare state, against helping people, and the kinds of religious arguments you mentioned are sort of invoked as a rationalization or as an excuse. Given that, how should we take these views that seem to omit those concerns?
Well, to go back to Smith, Adam Smith was very clear that what all this was about was the welfare of the broad bulk of the working population. That was his phrase, the broad working population. Now, he happened to have lived in a world that racially was almost entirely Caucasian. That was simply the time in which he lived. But he was certainly sensitive to the notion of what happened in other parts of the world to people who were not white. And the evidence for this is that Smith was a strong abolitionist. Smith wrote against slavery. It's interesting that two people at the time who were the strongest against slavery were one economist and one religious figure, Smith and John Wesley. So I think Smith would have been appalled at the idea that large numbers of working people would have been deprived of the benefits of advances in standard of living for any reason, racial discrimination among others. He didn't address it because it wasn't relevant to the world in which he lived, but reading carefully what he said about the welfare of the broad bulk of the population, then one concludes that that's what he would have thought. Now, turning to America, in the book, I discuss the writings of quite a few of these economists who were strong abolitionists. Daniel Raymond was one, Francis Whalen was one, then moving after the abolition of slavery at the end of the Civil War, Richard T. Ely. So quite a few of these people were outspoken on the subject. But I don't think any of them would have accepted calmly the idea that advances in economic growth would be deprived or would be denied to people simply because they were of a different race. It runs against the grain of what they were writing.
Thank you. One more question. We've got a bunch of questions on the list, but one more question from me. Your previous work for a general audience, book for a general audience, The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, did have a somewhat different moral conception behind it. It was, as in its title, it was consequentialist. If I recall it correctly, it was making an argument about times of economic growth were more conducive to tolerance, to kind rather than cruel behavior, to a sort of non-necessarily religious liberalism. How do you think the scholars you talked about and the beliefs you talk about in your new book would reflect on what you had as the benefits of economic growth, which were not so much about who deserved it or not?
Oh, I think they would very much have agreed. And in fact, in my earlier book called The Moral Consequences of Growth, where incidentally I was using the word moral self-consciously in an 18th century way, I made clear that this is what people of the time believed. Hume was the most explicit on the subject. They believed that what they called scientific progress, what we would call progress in knowledge, led to progress in what they called the arts, what we would call economic progress, which in turn led to progress in government and the moral condition of society. Smith wrote along these lines, interestingly, not in The Wealth of Nations, it was in his lectures on jurisprudence, but in this, as in so many other things, I think he was following his mentor, Hume. Hume had a very famous essay from 1741, when Smith was only 18 years old, in which he described exactly this process. They thought that improvement in governance, in liberty, again, as Hume wouldn't have talked about tolerance because he wasn't he lived in a world in which our kind of religious and racial diversity wasn't present. But the idea of an open society, opportunity, good behavior, good governance, liberty. All of these things are what the 18th century people thought followed from economic progress, and they in turn thought that economic progress followed from improvements in knowledge. So I think they would have. This isn't. I talk about this when I talk about Hume in one chapter of the new book, but it isn't really the subject of the new book. But it's certainly consistent with what, and I would go along with your description of my argument in the earlier book as a consequentialist argument. That's a good description, but I think they would certainly have gone along with it. It was an Enlightenment argument, most clearly articulated by Hume.
Thank you, Ben. Turning now, grouping questions from our distinguished audience. A number of the participants are interested in your depiction of post-Calvinism, or the role of Calvinism versus the way famously Weber predicted it in Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism. Obviously, you deal with this at some detail in the book, but could you just summarize a bit about how the view you're describing differs from that of Weber, and why this view seems to have had more traction than, say, Weber's?
Yes. The first thing to say is that Weber was looking at an earlier period. Weber's famous 1905 book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, is mostly focused on the 17th century, and to a certain extent in America, he's focused on the 17th and on into the early 18th century, when people were predestinarian Calvinists. And therefore, he's looking at an earlier time. I'm focusing on the consequences of what happened a century and more later. So Weber is about the influence of belief in predestinarian Calvinism. And what I argue gave us our modern economics is the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism. So in that sense, you can think of my argument as Weber upside down. So I would accept that characterization. The second important difference is that Weber is looking at the influence of this religious thinking, for him predestinarian Calvinism, on the behavior of ordinary people out in the economy, out in the business world. I'm looking at the influence on the thinking of the people whose names we would recognize today as economists. So it's a difference between looking at an influence on behavior and looking at an influence on thinking. In effect, I'm doing intellectual history here. And the difference is important because naturally the thinkers who wrote down what we have as economics were part of the intellectual elite. And as in many societies along the path of what happened, what ordinary people in the world thought and what these elite intellectuals thought was different, and that also matters. So think of my idea as Weber upside down, but applied not to in the behavior of ordinary people, but the thinking of the intellectual elites.
Thank you, Ben. That's perfectly clarifying and memorable. Another question that's come up repeatedly on the Q&A function in different forms is, this makes a lot of sense, say, for US or UK, but we, of course, have seen capitalism develop into many other contexts, in China, obviously, but also in Catholic countries in Europe and elsewhere. So I realize that you chose your intellectual history to focus where it did, but what is your thinking about, have these ideas had an influence in China, in Catholic Europe, and also the reverse? How would the rise of capitalism in non-Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of places have influenced these thinkers, this point of view?
I think that's a very challenging question, and one that's easily the subject for many books that I haven't written, but I'm happy to speculate with you a bit. Let's focus on China. China's post-Mao Zedong economic policies have been very driven by exactly the thinking that we're describing. Adam Smith today is a much revered figure in China. Nonetheless, the Chinese form of market competition is not like ours. It's state-directed in a way that ours isn't. Now, that doesn't mean it's a reversion to the kind of state-granted monopolies that Smith was inveighing against in The Wealth of Nations. The question for my line of analysis would be, is there something in what the Chinese are doing that could be articulated, and maybe in China, in ways that I don't know, has already been articulated in a kind of different economic thinking that would be explainable on the basis of, let's say, the Confucian background of China? That's a very, very interesting question, I think. I don't pretend to have answered it, but if I had the background to answer it, which I don't, that's the form in which I would cast the question. It's when the Chinese get around to articulating the theory behind what they are doing, will it have a different flavor that could be attributed to their religious thinking? And I certainly don't know, but it's a wonderful question.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time in this Zoom era. I am so grateful to you, as are several hundred of participants I know are, for your lecture, your research, and your brilliance in expressing both of them. The book discussed today is the new book by Benjamin M. Friedman, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. A reminder that today's lecture by Ben and his slides will be available on the Peterson Institute website starting this afternoon, and that this was the 6th annual John Olcay Lecture in Ethics and Economics at the Peterson Institute. We are delighted and honored that Ben Friedman was the 6th lecturer, as I know John Olcay would have been and his family are. And we look forward to welcoming everyone for the 7th lecture in the series later this year by Thomas Jordan of the Swiss National Bank. With thanks to Benjamin Friedman and all who participated, this meeting is adjourned.